Hello, welcome back, everyone. This is Acid Horizon on Zer0 Books. And today we have with us a friend and comrade from the Flatline Constructs reading groups. It's James. James is with us here today, and we're going to talk a little bit about Mark Fisher, the progress that we've made in our reading group, and our impending reading of William Gibson's Neuromancer. Now, what I found fascinating about this book, and I have a hard copy here, this is the, translation, the one forwarded by ex-military, is that we get a picture of the early Mark Fisher, and there are some things happening here that may look a little bit different from the Fisher that we see in capitalist realism and the Fisher that we see in what would then be the sort of beginnings of acid communism. But there's also some recognizable notes as well. And we were hoping that we could touch on that today while addressing the concept of flatline constructs. What is a flatline construct? What was Mark Fisher trying to do with this? And for this, we bring James along because James is an important voice in the reading group. And now that he's here today, we can talk about his experience, not only in our reading group, but what he's done before in his encounter with the text. So, James, welcome. Please feel free to give your own introduction and what is going on with Mark Fisher and Flatline Constructs.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me on. I've been really enjoying the reading group so far and just like Acid Horizon in general. I guess for a bit on me, I'm MA student in Media Studies at the University of Colorado. I recently started as a certificate student at the New Center as well, which has been really interesting. And yeah, I guess with Flatline Constructs, it's been text I'm really interested in. Actually, last fall, I facilitated a reading group on it in the Existence is Innocent Discord community, which I think is now defunct. But regardless, it was a really interesting experience. And coming back to it again this time around, I'm sort of asking maybe some different questions with what I'm trying to get from the text. But yeah, like you mentioned, this is, early Fisher, that there isn't much of writing from him from this period outside of the CCRU text, at least as what's available. And those are, in a different register, I guess, than later Fisher of capitalist realism, Ghost of My Life. And I think what's really interesting about Flatline Constructs is you really get to see what I would say is like the bridge between CCRU to K-punk, I guess. And what's going on here, just as a general overview for those unfamiliar with the text, is that Fisher's looking at works of primarily science fiction and cyberpunk more specifically, and as well mainly I'd say like Deleuze and Guattari, Baudrillard, and Marshall McLuhan, and trying to, I guess what I would say is extend existing theories of science fiction. He's going to reference Frederick Jameson as well for his kind of literary theories about postmodernism and science fiction. But yeah, that's kind of generally what Fisher sets out to do, is to sort of do this overview. And I think the main text, like you mentioned, William Gibson's Neuromancer, as well as Cronenberg's Videodrome, are two key reference points, as well as the Ridley Scott Blade Runner and the book it was based on, Do Android Dream of Electric Sheep. But yeah, I think that's a good starting point, just if anyone's not familiar with the text, I guess, what's covered and what Fisher's setting out to do and why it's relevant.
Yeah, what I see him trying to do here is not only develop this concept of flatline constructs, but also this notion of Gothic materialism, which I think is so important. And one of the things that he brings to this sort of vector of scholarship is, for example, in theorizing Gothic materialism, he juxtaposes Deleuze and Guattari with Baudrillard as occupying either side of the divide of this Gothic materialism, where Deleuze and Guattari represent the sort of positive or perhaps even optimistic version of this Gothic materialism, and Baudrillard occupying this sort of negative role. Actually, I'll turn to Adam, because Adam is quite invested in this work. What's Gothic materialism?
Just to sort of give it more sort of foreground this a little bit, because this is occurring whilst Fisher is doing his PhD. This is Fisher's PhD under Sadie Plant, conducted in Warwick, sort of late 90s, I think almost to the early 2000s. You can still actually access this thesis on Warwick's website. And fundamentally, what Fisher's trying to do here is to use cyberpunk fiction, which is fundamentally a poetics, a speculative imagination about what computers can do and what the acceleration of time under conditions of instantaneous communication and communication across virtual networks, what William Gibson would term as cyberspace, and to use that to produce a new theory of materialism, which he calls Gothic materialism. Now, Gothic materialism for him is equivalent to cybernetic realism, which is to say that the real can be understood cybernetically as a system of interlocking functions, essentially a model of essentially you can understand reality by modeling it in terms of a cybernetic system of inputs and outputs, which feed back upon each other to correct themselves, to direct themselves in new kinds of ways, be it negatively, in the sense of negative feedback, where a system is, for example, a system has a mechanism within it that limit or pushes back against a certain direction of travel. Well, the classic example of a negative feedback mechanism is, of course, a thermostat, because a thermostat relies on periodically turning a heat source on and off in order to maintain a stable temperature at the desire, to the desire of the person who is using it. And so, if the heat level is going up, the thermostatic sort of regulator moves against that heat going up by turning off the heat, and therefore moving against the direction of travel of the body of the thing being heated, which is, of course, the heater. And it's very similar to the root of the word cybernetic, which is kybernetes, steering. If you're steering a boat and you want to go right, or you want to keep going center on somewhere, you take the steering wheel, you go really far to the right, and then suddenly you gradually taper it back to the left so you can go on to a certain course that you want. And then you have positive feedback, which is really what the CCRU are focusing on here. Positive feedback, it's a bit like exponential growth. You have 2 rabbits in the field, a couple of months later, you've got 300 of the fuckers. Or, for example, cancer, it's a positive feedback loop. Or panic in a crowd. There was a case I remember years ago in London. It was in Oxford Circus Station, which is on the big main shopping street in London. And someone knocked over a traffic cone, made a huge bang. One person started running. Suddenly, some person sees that someone's running. So something's, they heard a bang, there might be a bomb, then they start running. And then suddenly 40 of them start running, then the whole station is in panic. And that's the kind of feedback system we call positive feedback, which accelerates in the direction of travel that the system is going. Now, to read things cybernetically in this sense is, as we said, negative and positive feedback mechanisms, but also cybernetics is the science of control and communication in the animal machines. It's about using feedback as a means of controlling the direction of systems, accelerating them in some ways, redirecting them in other ways, but also how do you talk about a cybernetic system in terms of feedback? You talk about the way in which systems communicate both internally and externally, such that new information comes into the system as feedback, as data, in a way that you can now correct the course or accelerate it off course, so to speak. So the theory of materialism that Mark Fisher is putting forward here is going to be the central one of the CCRU, which is cybernetic realism. It is all flows of data and communication. It is all material flows of data and communication. And the question is, now we have technologies that embody this and show it to us in a brute fact. The brute fact here is the screen. The screen is for Mark Fisher also calls the Gothic flatline. Now, the term flatline comes from Gib Neuromancer. Particularly, the idea of a flatline construct comes from a character who is known as the Flatline, who is this guy who plugs himself into cyberspace, once fried his brain, had brain death, came back. That's why he's called the Flatline. However, by the time you get to the book in Neuromancer, and I'm sorry to spoil the book, but it's really old now, it's like the big spoiler, Flatline is already dead. He lives as a construct, a datafied version of himself, kind of like in the game Cyberpunk 2077, Keanu Reeves is just this memory bank personality and a simulation of the personality. The flatline construct is that. And the point of calling it a flatline construct for Fisher is that the flatline is very similar to the screen itself, because on the other side of the screen, all you have is functions. And functionality and activity is therefore, for him, it's indifferent to whether the agency that's enacting these kind of things, Keanu Reeves can still do things to you in Cyberpunk 2077, but he's dead. I mean, here's how he defines the Gothic flatline. A plane where it is no longer possible to differentiate the animate from the inanimate, and where to have agency is not necessarily to be alive. The Gothic flatline designates a zone of radical immanence, and to theorize this flatline demands a new approach, one committed to the theorization of immanence. This thesis calls that approach Gothic materialism. Now, to sort of present this in like a very blunt image. So if you're listening to this right now, knows so editing, we use a tool sometimes called Descript, which processes our voice and it can actually replicate our voice sometimes. You don't know if I'm alive or dead if you're listening to this. If you're watching this, I could simply be, an AI generated mishmash of the same background, the same motions I usually make, the same references to cybernetics I've been regurgitating for God knows how many episodes. The functionality and the agency of what I can do to you through talking, which is provoke an image, provoke an idea, provoke a line of imagination, are now disconnected from my actual life because I have been translated into a construct which is playing back. I mean, you're seeing me through the screen, but really the thing that's actually acting to project an image of me through the screen is a system of chips. It's sand we talk to think. I'm just talking sand to you people right now. That's not to sort of denigrate myself, but in Fisher's terms, this is the reduction, or not the delinking of a transcendental, central, fluffy humanist subject from its own operability, its own material functions. Because the age of communication allows us to record ourselves and have agency as if we were not present and even as if we weren't alive.
So that then brings us to the question of these various sort of interpretations of not only the flatline construct, which Adam did a fantastic job of explicating, but also this concept of a body without organs is kind of operating in the background here. And maybe we can talk about those two things in conjunction with one another. One of the things that I think everyone should read when they pick up Flatline Constructs is the introduction by ex-military. It's brilliant. And it's there that we get a couple of quotes that sort of set us in the right direction to, describe what a flatline is. And I thought I'd read the quotes, and then maybe we can kind of talk about, some of the philosophical mediators that are behind Deleuze, and we'll get James's take on this too. So the question is, what is a flatline? The flatline is where everything happens, the other side, behind or beyond the screens of subjectivity, the site of primary process, where identity is produced and dismantled, the line outside. And in parentheses, we get Deleuze. Delineates not a line of death, but a continuum unfolding, or maybe continual unfolding, but ultimately going beyond both death and life. And the note there in Fisher's text was Foucault in parentheses. Ex-military says, the highway machine is a flatlining of previous modalities of control and surveillance, complicit in its own immaterialization. So when we think about the idea of a control society and the proliferation of cybernetic technologies, I like this idea that there is this incessant process of becoming immaterial. And this kind of inhabits the provocation that Fisher puts forward, which is asking ourselves this question: what if we are not alive, but in fact, we are as dead as the machines are, right? And he brings in this concept of the anorganic continuum, right? As if everything that exists, from my body, my skin, my blood, my bones, exists coextensively and in the sort of same field of operation as my computer, my camera, my microphone, all linked together on this sort of flattened out surface ontologically, where everything is connected as a singular machine, but all is dead. And the sort of presiding non-organic or anorganic entifying energy or machine is this disruptive body without organs, which dismantles this sort of traditional notion of subjectivity that we have. And it's interesting, Fisher goes to Deleuze and Guattari quite a bit to say that subjectivity, and this is something they get from Anti-Oedipus, is subjectivity is something that happens alongside these other processes. Whereas when we look to, for example, Cartesian notions of the mind and body, things that we get even in Freud, for example, that this idea of the head, of the Kyber, as it were, right, that sits atop the rest of this mass, is that which is functioning and controlling us. But what Fisher is saying is that in the cybernetic age, that locus of control gets displaced and everything gets flattened out into this sort of cybernetic anorganic continuum. But anyway, that's my take on flatline constructs. James, I was hoping you could kind of fill in the blanks. What is your sort of perspective on that, maybe in relation to some of Fisher's philosophical mediators?
Sure. And I think as you were just talking about when you were talking about the inorganic continuum, I think the sort of inspiration for that most directly, he said, it's his Donna Haraway's, our machines are disturbingly lively while we ourselves are frighteningly inert. And I think, that you could think about that the entire time reading this and just see how much of like a deep effect that had on Fisher and, the rest of the kind of Warwick cybernetic stuff going on. And just to kind of go back to what Adam was talking about with the cybernetic realism as the understanding for Gothic materialism, that he was talking about with these sort of positive feedback processes. And I think what's the kind of maybe core or Gothic elements to this, on the one hand, like, yes, there is the kind of he talks about unlife, this kind of, he uses the golem myth as an example, that you have something that is made of clay, but it comes to life and it begins to move about. And I think that a notion of the unintended consequence of the actions which you yourself set in motion is where the sort of science fictional exciting plot elements that he pulls out of these texts come back to bear. He takes that sort of process as the kind of return of some kind of runaway feedback and some aberrant cause, that we would say that he would say is like an agency without a subject. That kind of represents why this kind of cybernetic acceleration is not just about time, but it's about space as well. Because for him, it's the cybernetic realism is also a realism about cyberspace. He's often using Gibson's understanding of cyberspace and Neuromancer, where in the book, the main character Case, and the other characters as well, they jack in to cyberspace, and in that it's this very mechanical cyborg kind of conjunction with information flows, and what we would today think about as the internet, but it's a very embodied experience. You can think of it like entering the Matrix, except there's a physical kind of jacking in, and that idea that where they're going is a real place, that's like partly the most important, like, I think, declaration that kind of Fisher wants to say. And I think you can understand that both through that, okay, well, this is, the internet is always going to be constituted by these kinds of cybernetic information processes. But at the same time, the sort of aberrant, let's say, golems or the replicants, if we're going to talk about Blade Runner, that the consequences of this kind of runaway feedback are themselves the sort of agencies that get conjured. And it's this kind of, you set something in motion, and if it begins to act about in ways that you did not anticipate, you did not plan, that's you're confronted with the possibility that there's an agency within this. And that's the kind of our machines are disturbingly lively side, and the we ourselves are frighteningly inert side would then be that he opens the book with this passage without recounting it, but it's Gustav Meyrink, and he's reading about basically the poem or the aphorism talks about he's watching these newspapers floating in the wind at different rates, and that they look as though they're moving on their own accord, despite the fact the narrator knows it's wind. And he wonders, what if we ourselves are dancing out this kind of unknowable, unpredictable dance, and there's just this wind that we cannot see, that we cannot feel, that is blowing through us and causing us to move. And I mean, and that is the opening lines of the introduction to the text. And so I just think on kind of both sides of that, it's that's part of the flat line, right? It's where those two ideas meet. It's that we are more material, less of this kind of, I don't know, more than material beings. And he wants to tear us down on the other side. If we want to force down the agencies that come from the material, that's also going to be elevated. And where we meet can also be thought of that. That's the flat line, is where those two things meet.
It's very easy to link to someone like Nick Land when we talk about Mark Fisher and cybernetics. But I think, one of the things that gets lost in understanding of Fisherian or Fisher's relationship to cybernetics and the cybernetic culture research units is that a text like Flatline Constructs is just dripping with cyber feminism. You have the Cyborg Manifesto of Donna Haraway, as the quote you brought up, of course. And of course, you have Sadie Plant, who, his book Zeros and Ones is about looking at actually, the kinds of labor, the kind of very concepts of digitality, literally the digits on our hands, tied to the process of weaving, and the history of computer is actually inextricably tied to the ideas of gendered labor when it comes to weaving and digitality of gendered labor, in a way that there is a new possibility of a new digital femininity, as Eddie Plant calls it, new digital women. And I think the agency here is that in understanding ourselves not as these self-enclosed subjects, or sort of transcendentally confined, or confined simply as thinking things detached from the world. Understanding ourselves cybernetically for Fisher is understanding the self, or understanding the material beings we are, as modular, and therefore we can reconfigure them. We can sort of short circuit the ways in which we're configured. And there's the agency of something like Blade Runner, which is as in Replicant, and this is one of the ways that someone like that, and also the CTIU generally does think about them, is that they don't have a mother. They are detached from the familial triangle, and one could reconfigure themselves in the cyberspace. I mean, this is the idea, for example, with the body of our organs. This is what Gibson's doing really with Wintermute. And eventually, the AI Neuromancer itself, Wintermute and Neuromancer, are both AIs who are operating of their own accord through various personae. Wintermute is just ultimately just a sub-personality of Neuromancer. And how does Wintermute commute? Wintermute doesn't always commute through telephones. It also commutes through Armitage, who's the guy who hires Case to do the jobs. And who is Armitage? Armitage is a former schizophrenic who is, his brain has been reconfigured by some sort of AI therapy, but really he's just being piloted. His brain has been reconfigured into a new subjectivity. And there's a great theory of escape we get from that. Everything from sort of, Joe Eshel's Afrofuturism to Plant and Haraway, and even to some of the cybernetic, or sort of cybernetized futures we get in the Marxist sort of fictions of Carl Neville, of course. And I think the point of the materialism is not simply to shock us, but to also sort of find new kinds of agency. I mean, of course, Fisher does lay down a lot on the horror. He, at one point, equates cybernetic realism to body horror, but it's the body horror that your body can change. For example, he focused on Videodrome, James Woods putting a VCR into himself, or the very fact that, my ears, in a sense, in a intensive virtual sense, are now stretching all the way to where you all are. And say, well, my eyes are stretching that way. In the same way that occasionally I feel a twitch, like a phantom limb in my pocket, that my phone has vibrated. It is like Chalmers' extended mind theory, but it is really the body is being reconfigured. We can now plug it into stuff, and this is an old school Marxist idea, really, which is the idea that as capitalism proliferates new technologies, or at least proliferates them to reproduce itself, it also creates new needs. Very few people needed a train. For most of humanity, people have not needed trains. They have not needed, performance review forms. They have not had a need for news or internet connectivity in the ways that we become dependent on it for how we regulate ourselves now. People didn't need, for example, watches which are accurate to the minute, because we wasn't being pressured to go to as many places with such accuracy, because the work structure of labor and therefore labor time was different. So I just really want to pick up that strand and sort of link it back to this sort of wider tradition, where he's not just being sort of a goth for the sake of gothness.
Yeah, Adam, and I think especially in what you were just saying, especially you were talking about Armitage and Wintermute, as well as in the examples of whether it's a watch or anything else. I think what Fisher, when he says, is, I think the words he uses, the key to decoding Neuromancer is Deleuze and Guattari's Orchid and the Wasp example. The sort of the orchid wasp assemblage sort of territorializes the wasp to become the reproductive organ of the orchid, because the way orchids reproduce is they have pollen. Bees, wasps come along, pick up the pollen, deposit it on other flowers, and that the flowers themselves do not need organs capable of reproduction, because the wasp is their organ of reproduction. And you were talking about Wintermute occupying Armitage as a sort of mask, as he's donning someone else to sort of, and what he's really doing is he's territorializing Armitage through this schizophrenization, this sort of rebuilding him up from his like catastrophic helicopter crash or whatever, to use him as an organ for his reproduction. I mean, that's what Case and Molly and the gang are up to in Neuromancer. Is they're being duped. I mean, again, spoilers, but they're being duped into acting as Wintermute's and Neuromancer's sort of recombination, and this sort of reproductive organ is what all of them become. And as you were to kind of bring it back down from the science fiction to the examples you were talking about, with whether it's trains, whether it's watches, that and Fisher's always he sticks with this kind of understanding of capital, at least in the background for the rest of his career, that we are its organs of reproduction, that, he has this line in another K-Punk post where, the capital mind virus has occupied me too. Right. And in that, wider context of that quote, he's talking about sitting at a desk and working, like you said, Adam, we never needed to do, whether it's the watch or the train, the things that facilitate our participation in capital's organs of reproduction. How does the system perpetuate itself? It perpetuates itself through us as, and that confronts ideas of agency, which is really what Flatline Constructs is always doing. It's confronting someone's, maybe Fisher would say, naive attachment to this really independent agency, because what we are we are the wasps of the orchids, and at the same time, though, we would think of ourselves as the orchids, and we send our machines out to do our bidding and to maintain and reproduce ourselves. And what he's always going to do is he's going to take those kinds of dualisms, he's going to show the way they determine one another. And I think that's a sort of important grounding, I guess. And I think it's only a 2-page section on the orchid and the wasp, but even it's as clear as can be about why it's so important for understanding these science fiction texts. And then I guess also what you mentioned, James Woods and the VCR and Videodrome, that is, again, the new flesh is the perpetuation of this Videodrome cybernetic kind of apparatus, that James Woods becomes reterritorialized and becomes an organ in the kind of maybe more sexual sense in the movie explicitly, but it's the same kind of message that Fisher's pulling out of all this science fiction.
Great. Yeah, I can't remember if Fisher mentions it or not, but I think Adam's example of the missing phone from your pocket as the kind of phantom limb of, this massive cybernetic skin that stretches over all of us is really an apt example of a kind of Gothic materialism, in the sense, like it's almost like an amputation when it's not there. But not only that, think about when we're in the shower, for example, and we're away from our technologies, even that sort of negative cybernetic space becomes deterritorialized by the cybernetic in those moments where we have the shower thought that becomes a tweet later on. It becomes a sort of incubation device, an alchemical retort for us. Like, this is what we're going to do once we towel off, and maybe even we're not fully toweled off yet, to fire off that tweet. This is something that we talked about with Cooper in our episode on Baudrillard and ecstasy. But that aside, I wanted to talk about capitalism a little bit, because I think what we get inside Flatline Constructs is a sort of incipient or burgeoning theory of capitalist realism in some way. Because there's even a line in the text where Fisher writes, "You cannot penetrate that which already envelops you." And clearly his theory of the cybernetic is one of this massive ongoing construction of a digital envelope into which we are all inserted, and that we become part of itself. And I was wondering, what is the role of Marx in this? What is the role of capital in all of this? Do we really see as I'm suggesting, an incipient theory of capitalist realism? And also, what does that, how does that impact perhaps our critiques of Fisher, maybe not only here, but in capitalist realism? Like, there's a way in which I think Fisher sets us up to not find lines of flight outside of the cybernetic. Does he provide us with any tools, or does he gesture towards any possible escapes, save the exception of becoming fully integrated with this machine in some way? And James, I'll start with you, but I know Adam and Will might have something to say about that.
Yeah, and you said, talking about Mark Fisher, but also his, where does Marx come into this? He gets the quote, his favorite of all Marxist lines: "British industry, vampire-like, could but live by sucking blood, and children's blood too." This kind of it vampire-like, lives the more it sucks. That for him, that's this. Again, this kind of Gothic element, that's Marx's Gothic capitalism, that it is this kind of viral propagation mechanism. And again, to bring in a virus is even better example of like orchid wasp kind of territorialization, because what does a virus do to a cell? Hijacks its DNA, begins to turn the host cell into basically just a vehicle for replicating the virus, that the cell dies because it spends all its energy pumping out more viruses. And to kind of return to capitalism and capitalist realism as well, that this idea that there is this kind of unknowable thing that is capitalism already kind of sets you up for a fatalism. Now, I think the logic behind capitalist realism, I think, is actually takes a very different lineage than this one. I mean, Walt Jameson is still part of it. You know, he leaned on Jameson and Zizek as well for capitalist realism, but there's still this. I think there's more of a lineage about thinking about political futurity, and politics is almost entirely absent from Flatline constructs. And any, you know, he's not. If capitalist realism is talking about, I don't know, like Tony Blair, like half the time, and you know what happened to the left, and what did neoliberalism do to the left? The words left and right don't even appear in Flatline constructs. So I do think there's a sort of similarity, though, in this kind of fatalistic perspective on capitalism. But as far as the lineages he takes to get from one to the other, I guess you could say maybe there's a maturing, right? He goes to more standard literary and cultural theory in, you know, the aughts, like, you know, in the years following Flatline constructs. He moves away from this kind of, you know, 90s cyber theory in his theorizing of capitalist realism. But I do think what capital is, and it kind of remains consistent, and that is this unknowable thing that is I don't know, the unprefix that Fisher kind of leans in a lot on, whether he takes that from unlife or and you know, he takes Heimlich from Freud and Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and he has a section in this book just kind of talking about that, and all this, I guess, to say that capital's I guess Lovecraftian, kind of beyond our control, beyond our realm of knowing or operating with. Yeah, I would say that's what you were kind of talking about. What line of flight does Fisher present us in Flatline constructs, and what line of flight comes out of capitalist realism? It's no coincidence that there's none, because the capitalism we're dealing with is beyond human agency.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, just to make draw a parallel before I pass it to Adam or Will. The one thing that Deleuze and Guattari say is that, and there's a famous quote, I think it's in one of the Desert Islands interviews, where they say that within the context of capitalism, all transactions, all accruals of profit, all negative externalities, all appear rational. The thing that does not appear rational is capital itself. And sort of built into their idea or concept of the body without organs, this is the one thing that the flows of capital cannot break into, is this entity that is capital itself. And so there's kind of a precursor to this Gothic materialism. You know, we can't break into the blob, as it were, or we can't break into that unnameable thing. And, you know, what it is that will bring about moving to the outside. Well, that's actually the one thing that Fisher does say that I recall just now, is that the flat line is the line that takes us to the outside, but it does so in virtue of desubstantializing everything, turning everything immaterial. But with that said, I'll throw it to Adam or Will.
So because we're like 40 minutes in, and like I'm always the skeptic of these sorts of materialisms, especially these ecologies that have within them, you know, some sort of absolutely spectral, brand new, never before seen modes of management. You know, when it comes to Fisher's understanding of the cybernetic, or perhaps the cybernetic as such, I have to maintain a kind of strange admonitory tone here to say that a lot of this is found as far back as Machiavelli's The Prince. You know, the management of the flow of fortune, of the gap between administration and potentiality, right? That Deleuze talks about in The Logic of Sense, right? Where the revolutionary dwells is in the gap between the crisis and its management, right? My other fear here is that a lot of this discussion about the liveliness of machines meeting the inert nature of human life is transposing, on the one hand, a kind of old school natural philosophy vitality onto a foreclosed political existence. And the other is to take the ledger that we understand as human capital, but also of labor potentiality in the Marx of Capital Volume 1, and positing it as a vital force, to read labor potentiality back in a sort of neo-Aristotelian fashion. So some of my concerns here is that it seems to me like one of the problems that Mark Fisher continues to have, and of course this is no surprise, is that he just lacks a reading of biopolitics together. You know, I think that sometimes the way in which we talk about, say, the lost cell phone or something like that, or the interconnectivity or our machines, is to create a figure of the cyborg which bypasses a history of abnormality and a history of normalizing power. And I think this is a problem that goes as far back as Donna Haraway, right? There was in the 90s or early 2000s an American author who wrote, I think, an equally problematic piece, but I just want to show that this is a space of contention called the era of the triborg, right? Where we have smartphones now, so like we're all cyborgs, and the author, if I forget who it was, but she was very skeptical of this sort of approach to human authenticity, and I think that some of the ways in which, for example, Freud is utilized actually recalls back to Freud's relationship with early 19th century psychology, especially the work of Charcot on instinct and destiny. So I think that in some ways, a lot of what we see, because it's mediated by a form of communication that is somewhat new, the reality is that the biopolitics of life still lingers in our complete lack or willingness to take into account what sovereignty stakes itself on, which is life, different ways, right? But the propelling of dead bodies, that we are living in a dead time as dead human beings, where the machines are instead alive, transposes a kind of vitality to apparatuses of control and capture that I think we need to be very weary of. I think this is the same kind of technopositivism that, Craig, you were critical of in Marcuse when we spoke with Ray Brassier. Mark Fisher's a great theorist, but he's still weighed down by the fact that he has a very particular, very English, and frankly an accelerationist reading of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. So I want to maintain the problematic of administration, not insofar as I want to posit an opposition between d'état and the administration, right? It's the claim between administration and human life, and the manageability of human life, and the production of human life as a metaphysical substance, which means it's eminently, it's machinated. It can be machined. I want to posit these things as not brand new and still as dangerous as they were, irrespective of the new sheen that we might put on it, given contemporary communication. I know that I'm the the Debbie Downer here, but it's been a few days since I've been on Acid Horizon, so maybe this has all just been welling up.
Well, can I press you
I
for an
can
example?
respond. Oh, sorry.
Oh, do you mind if I press you for an example
Yeah.
on one thing? Because the interesting sort of line that you said there is that this theory of the cyborg either bypasses or disconnects from the biopolitical or the biopolitical subject. Like if somebody pressed you to, like me right now, to put a finer point on that, like what is a specific instance or institution where you see a convergence between those problems?
I would see the problem manifesting in as much as the cyborg itself is treated as a kind of line of flight. I would say that in any mode of, or any game of power, any apparatus, any piece of technology, and we talk about this in the beginning of our book, has within it gaps. But the idea that, the era of the cyborg is something that, say, is foreign to the sovereign right to life and to make live is, I think, wrong. I also think that it's guilty of engaging in the same thing that certain Marxists did in the 80s, where they reduced the sovereign claim to life or the administrative claim to life to the management of labor potentiality, of labor power. Because the management of labor power is a facet of this, no question. But I think to flatten it to that, and then to posit sort of the cyborg as, the new modality with which this flattening takes place, I think is a problem. That doesn't mean that I don't think that the cyborg and these new modes of communication and so on all have possibilities for new forms of ecstasis or a kenosis that can meet this new kinetics of power, because I think everything can be rendered at a certain point inoperable, right? But it requires something more than an aesthetic understanding of contemporary capitalism, which I think is oftentimes what Mark Fisher falls into, is that he falls into really a philosophical aesthetics of political power. And so, yeah, that's it from me.
All right. Adam?
Well, I mean, I'd like to respond to that by sort of bolstering it, because I mean, not only to think about books like, I mean, there's books of Will suggested before, like Melinda C. Hall's book, The Bioethics of Enhancement, where the idea is that transhumanism is always like, we're going to get rid of all of these abnormalities, perfect ourselves. I ascended to the blissful eternity of the machine. Like the Adeptus Mechanicus or Warhammer 40,000 or something. But I think one of the things that we pick up actually in the first part of the book we wrote, which is the first chapter, is called The Cyberpunk Present, which is one of the things that is often missing from how central it is to cyberpunk, is healthcare. Cyberpunk is a genre steeped in the politics of healthcare, because there's all this cybernetic arms. Like when people think cybernetics, they think of the cyborg. They think of, I've got an arm now which is 10 times stronger. I've got implants in my brain that release, drugs, so I don't have to feel pain in a combat situation. I can have adrenaline boosters, to get out of a fight. And ultimately, one of the main sort of themes in a lot of cyberpunk fiction is, okay, well, how do you maintain this? I mean, for example, the Deus Ex games. There's the whole politics there of people were mandatory, so they're forced to get biomechanical arms to be stronger lifters, to be day laborers and tradespeople, and then they're discriminated against for it. There's a pressure to augment oneself with cybernetic technologies, and fundamentally, it's also, a cybernetic transhumanist might say, "Isn't this great? We can correct the brain, we can erase all of these things, all these abnormalities." When this is a biopolitics of disability. People will, the transhumanists will say, we can eliminate all these disabilities, and people will say, well, I'm fine as I am. Thank you very fucking much. I'd rather just not be. Society. It's actually society that is. Well, not to jump too much into a British social model disability here, but it is. For example, the idea of why is it always the cybernetic legs and not the flying wheelchair? To give like a very sort of crude example, and I think this also goes back to the fact that cyberpunk is fundamentally. Sorry, I'm not actually. I was about to say cyberpunk is neoliberal. No, cyberpunk is a warning about neoliberalism. And therefore, when we think about healthcare in the case of cyberpunk, it's always people trying to compete to make that next maintenance payment on their cybernetic organs. Case had to do the job for Armitage, or the sort of repairs that Armitage has had done to his nervous system will maybe be destroyed. The fight for healthcare against institutions, because fundamentally the cybernetic implants, you don't need them to be implants, because what the implant does is a feedback sensor which picks up, okay, this person's in pain, so I'm going to go release some drugs. Or a cybernetic implant has maybe something like, oh, if you haven't made your payments, your cybernetic arm will shut down. Now we have these sensors and intervention mechanisms. We just sort of put them in hospitals and clinics. Those are the cybernetic sensors and regulators. The closest things we have to cybernetic implants today are stuff like pacemakers, of course, and insulin pumps, for example, where it senses, okay, low blood sugar, high blood sugar, administer. But of course, ultimately, these are all regulated and their access to them via systems that rely on an incredible informational mapping of the bodies and the particular ailments and bodily differences that pass through them. And I think one of the ways in which cyberpunk sort of deals with this, but also fails to deal with it, and this is quite a Badiouian point for people who listen to the last Acid Horizon episode, is that the ontology of cybernetics that a lot of cyberpunk fiction promises is poetic. So once William Gibson said, I used the word modem before I knew what a modem was, because it was all about the poetics of it, the poetics of technology. And Badiou talks about this, this poetic ontology, where there's always this excess of being just constantly withdrawing for us. And for Mark Fisher in a way, there's also a similar kind of excess of possible functions we can play and possible lives we could lead that these cybernetic things are offering us. But fundamentally, the cybernetic realism is this Baudrillardian thing of fully diving into the map, because the map is more interesting than the territory and is actually more expansive. has more possibility for territorialization than the territory itself. The problem is, and we've seen this really, I mean, Fisher saw this too to some extent, is that the means of cybernation were privately owned. It wasn't a Wintermute, this kind of glitchy AI, which is because everyone from Henry Kissinger to Eric Schmidt to Elon fucking Musk is afraid that they've made like Neuromancer. They're afraid that, we've accidentally glitched the system. There's a little gap in our program. We haven't controlled it properly. And therefore it's going to start communicating with us, working under our back. Gibson brings this up, for example, with the idea of a Turing cop. A Turing cop is someone who polices AIs, makes sure they don't go out of control, they stay in their place. Now, fundamentally, there's going to be a Turing police existing soon. It's just the things they're going to be policing do not exist. ChatGPT's moderation is underpaid Kenyan workers. Most of the data packets that come in for surveillance and stuff like that is produced by people doing so-called micro work, predominantly in refugee camps. Every time there's an AI, it is just a person. The AIs actually have nothing to do with technological devices. AI is actually the automation of processes of subjectivation that are done in the name of capitalist production, and the commodity that they produce is data. Data is a new kind of production because it's a commodity which doesn't rot. You can spend it again and again, circulate it again and again, make data, make metadata on data. And that's the cyberpunk. The problem with cyberpunk really is that it's real. And it's far worse than we could have expected. It's not like we didn't get any gadgets from it. The gadgets weren't fantastic, but for example, phones are mandatory. Essentially a little tracking device after time, but you always need to be producing data. This is sadly some conspiratorial weirdos have picked this up for some reason and run wild about it because they think it's something to actually, dominate them. But for example, contactless payments being increasingly mandatory on public transport in the UK. This isn't because they want to control where you are. It's just that they can sell data on, know which stations are more popular than others and stuff. But fundamentally, as we move on to a form of capitalism which is producing more and more data, feedback, management is itself something. Management as a means of production. There we go. It's definition of cyberpunk. Why didn't I put that in the fucking book? We don't know.
James, go ahead.
And I think, Will, what you were saying about biopolitics, and Adam, how you kind of tied that back to Neuromancer, I kind of agree. That's one of the maybe biggest condemnations of this text. And Adam, as you were talking about when you were talking about Neuromancer, the way Armitage sort of recruits our protagonist Case is that he after, if I remember the book correctly, an experience in cyberspace gone wrong, something goes wrong, he's no longer able to access. And he also is, I think, haunted by whether it's memories or physical pain from the kinds of trauma he's experienced as in cyberspace, that he also uses drugs quite often. And the Fisher, whether it's Videodrome or Neuromancer, uses addiction as a kind of, and especially when he's talking about William Burroughs, as a kind of stand-in for, and I think the quote I have here is the Burroughs theme of image addiction, correct quote. Addiction, already a becoming inorganic of the organism, is transferred over onto the technical machines as part of the production of artificial desire. And I think that right there is the sort of inhumanism that he's committed to that ignores biopolitical or agency as such, that this idea that addiction, and especially for Case, because his sort of addiction is coming from the sort of trauma he's induced, and that is also what Armitage is holding over him, is this capacity to heal. For Fisher and for Wintermute, it's he's become functionalized. He's become part of he's the wasp to Wintermute's orchid, and addiction is just a means to an end for something inhuman. Which what politics is there if you and your the struggles in your life are just manipulatable, and there's nothing really human about Case. He is a tool, and his addiction was the machine reterritorializing him. It doesn't sound like there's any room for politics or humanity in this equation. So I think that's a real sort of stop from the political in him.
Yeah, I'd also like to just take this all the way back to the philosophy of right. Because I think that the history of humanity as an object of refinement, at the production of civilization, the production of humanity as an object, right, of control, is inseparable from the history of civilization or from the civilizing project. And I think that in Hegel's philosophy of right just before he starts talking about the nature of work, right? And just after he talks about what the police, right? But not police in the way we understand it, but the science of police, right? Polizeiwissenschaft, God, close enough. He makes a strange addition because he's talking about when social conditions tend to multiply and need subdivide, right? And this creates luxury, which then needs to be policed, right? Splendor is probably the better term. Splendor was the term that the policing sciences used, but Knox puts luxury. But he adds this strange addition because he's talking about bourgeois society, right? He puts addition. The entire cynical mode of life adopted by Diogenes was nothing more or less than a product of Athenian social life. And what determined it was the way of thinking against which his whole manner protested. Hence, it was not independent of social conditions, but simply their result. It was a rude product of luxury. When luxury is at its height, distress and depravity are equally extreme, and in such circumstances, cynicism is the outcome of opposition to refinement. So what Hegel sees in Diogenes, in his barrel, is the virus of opposition to refinement. He misidentifies. First of all, he gets the cynic mode of life wrong, but that's a different issue. But what's more important is precisely what he sees. He sees in the cynic mode of life the opposition to refinement. And what exactly is Hegel's account of political history? Well, it's a history of recognition and opposition, but most importantly, it is the history of refinement. So for Hegel to see this in the cynic mode of life, and then Foucault, over 100 years later, to see it in a very different way, but with the same kind of strange centrifugality, and to see at the end of it another mode of existence, another kind of truth, and a truth that questions refinement, which is different, right, from the philosophical life, right, is, I think, really helpful here. Because I don't think any of these, to think that you can refine your way out of the philosophy of right, or to think that the state withers away and in its place what one finds is just the administration of things, whether it's the Engelsian, Hegelian, or, Corbynite imagination, it is a false one. So I think that the fact that this refinement has always produced and looked for opposition in the centrifugality, in the goings astray of management, I think shows that within this eugenic kernel that has manifested, I think, contemporarily in the cybernetic episteme, one also has to trace this not transhistorical, but historical kernel that sprouts up in different ways in the cynic. So I don't know. I just think that there is a fundamental difference, and there is a fundamental difference between cybernetic management and physiocratic management. But the centrifugality as the problematized object remains the same, and this other life is always haunting it, and it dwells within it. So I think that the cybernetic demands us not only to have a good understanding of technology, but to take a look again at everything from the way Machiavelli speaks of fortuna to, the way that the German and Italian police sciences understood, virtue and the state splendor, to human capital and Gary Becker, to Peter Singer's practical fucking ethics. So I don't know. I think that the cybernetic doesn't just speak to the contemporary, but I think it's particularly untimely in that way. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like maybe another way to put that, and feel free to correct me on this, but it's almost as if the optimism that lies behind cyberpunk and cyberpunk aesthetics, almost in a way presuppose, well, there's a kind of like Promethean optimism about it. And it almost presupposes its own refusal in a sense, because if a figure of refusal or a kind of subjectivity that refuses this optimism, refuses, the sort of papering over of the incipient or burgeoning critique of anything of the Promethean cybernetic order. Well, the cybernetic conceit already has built into it this function to tamp it down. Does that sound accurate? Like maybe you can kind of correct.
That's a I think a fantastic way to put this, right?
Yeah.
I think that in a certain sense, what's also being overlooked here, and what I've touched on, I think, in the past in my graduate school work, but never adequately. And in fact, it was a byproduct of a piece you wrote on Maurice Blanchot, was Deleuze's notion of the dogmatic image of thought,
Mhm.
and the figure that refuses an image of thought. Because I think that when you look at the way that philosophy of mind is trying to apprehend and take into account second order cybernetics, what we see actually operating underneath all of this is not a computational model, but actually a dogmatic image of thought that goes at least as far back as, like, the scholastic period
Mm.
of a causal account of intelligible and intuited specias. So I think yeah, I what I think is necessary instead is to do two things. A, to understand that gap that Deleuze speaks about in the logic of sense, and try really to meditate on it and take it seriously as an object of his philosophical work.
Yeah.
And B, to understand that the dark precursor is not your friend.
Yeah, it's almost as if the cybernetic is one of its functions is to put a defibrillator on rationality.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Right? Like that's one
I
of
mean, read Intelligence and Spirit, right? Like, you can only get 5 pages in until, Reza Negrestani is talking about, like, the education of disabled children. Like, he can't fucking escape the policing and the production of normalized and abnormal bodies and minds. It's really fucking dangerous. Like, we consider this shit to be, like, cool, and, like, a bunch of, like, fucking white grad students get to sit and pontificate about, who can think, what does think, and assume that has no bearing on apparatuses of control and capture. Like, for example, every time you meditate on something that you think is descriptive in, say, a Kantian account of the subject that is there with me in any discursive representation, right, or judgment, that is always a prescriptive measure, right? And that was the great merit of Deleuze's work, is to understand that when Kant develops the B deduction, or really even much earlier in the critique provides the categories, he multiplies his problems. So, like, I just think that everything from, the account of philosophical right, to an account of the juridical subject, to an account of the subject of capacities, all of this swirls around a history of philosophy that is trying to instrumentalize and to render operative the human being as an individual of capacities, as an individual of rights that are established through, deduced capacities, right? The juridical deduction in Kant is essentially like, if all of this is true, if none of this is true, then all things are nothing to me, right? That's the Geyer Wood translation, right? And the first thing I thought of was like, well, there's a certain famous refrain from a certain figure of refusal in the history of post-Kantian philosophy, a certain young Hegelian who wasn't particularly popular and still pretty much isn't. But yeah. Anyway, this isn't philosophical. I'm not saying anything academic. So
Max Stirner was not a young Hegelian. That is why everyone reads him wrong. He hated them all, and well, he didn't hate Edgar Bauer, but he didn't hate Bruno Bauer as much. But he didn't hate them. He hated their philosophies because philosophers may forget this, there's more to life than philosophy. But yeah, I mean, just to build on sort of the Schrodingerian aspect here, the Schrodingerian aspect is fundamentally the refusal to provide a theory of capacity. It's like, yeah, what can I do? What's in my power? What's in my power? Well, you'll know you will know when the insurrection starts. It's like you don't need the proletariat to suddenly go, we have the power. You'll know when they have the power because your trains aren't running, nothing's being produced, and all of your ports are blocked. It's not like
No, but by what
Roman
right are
don't
they
have
doing
to
it,
ask.
Adam? With what claim? Quid juris, Adam. Don't wait. Hold on. Doesn't the proletariat wage war because it is the just and right thing to do? Isn't that what it's supposed to be about? Aren't we constituting the true universal power? I mean, what else is the march of history other than the establishment of a dictatorship of the proletariat that takes it by right? Anyway,
I'm going to step in here and pull Will off of.
Yeah.
So let's get back to what's germane for the time being. We're basically over the hour mark, and I want to give James a chance. We've certainly shown our hand here today, James. What are your big takeaways from this? What is your view, or what sort of commitments do you have to the work that's being done here? Where perhaps do you diverge from Mark Fisher? Let us know.
Yeah, and I think we've sort of covered, I think, the main I guess topics brought into focus by this book. We've talked about the body extensively and the way Fisher is using it as a tool for inquiry, but also, the way space is and cyberspace is recontextualized as sort of extensions of the real. And I think that latter for me, I think is where I personally pick up from this work and see a sort of path forward in this text, this kind of being a transition to maybe like a post-Baudrillardian media metaphysics, where the idea that I think Fisher takes from land of the implex and the way he talks about cyberspace as a fold, as whether it's the real physical servers running, that cyberspace is something physically located in the real, but it's just totally unlocalizable. That going from there and talking about that process of this kind of production of space, whether cyberspace or otherwise, as for me, I think the place where talking about media and talking about things that happen in the digital becomes very relevant. I came to this text and the work of Fisher broadly, like I think many people over the last 2 years during the pandemic, where we were all online 24/7 for and connecting and communicating with one another and meeting new people. And if I'm not mistaken, Acid Horizon kind of spins out of this as well, and all of these different productions that kind of came out of as not solely cyberspatial existence, but at least a significantly more cyberspatial existence. That I think what's afforded by the way Fisher treats cyberspace in this, and this is, I'm not saying he's the one who came up with this, it's just what this text has done for me, is that you then have, okay, well, this is not an outside. This conversation we're having right now, this is face to face. Sure, there's mediation going on, but I'm not going to posit some pre-mediated state anyway. And I think that's the kind of sort of post-Baudrillardian step we can take, and not just decry everything as hyper real. Because if you're going to do that, well, then the last 3 years have been a pretty shitty time for you. Like all we've done is live increasingly in fakeness and cyberspace, and that kind of perspective, I just think is a very cynical, apolitical, kind of fatalist strand that comes from a perspective on media. So I guess for me, the main takeaway and the real productive aspect I find of this is really the cybernetic realism, is the what we can take from this is what happens in cyberspace. We call it the digital now. We call it not really cyberspace anymore, but that what happens there is real. And that is, I think, whether he takes that lots of different ways, I think that is also a different strand and a path maybe not taken as much by the accelerationist canon. If they were primarily interested in time, which is why they eventually landed on, through Benjamin Noyes 10 years later, the term acceleration to talk about time, I think there's a strand about space and about cybernetic realism. And maybe we could, rethink as well the ways that like problematic aspects of, say, Horrorway, as we were kind of talking about earlier, and sort of rethink those through a different kind of strand of cybernetic realism that doesn't rely so much on time, that focuses on space, and that really prioritizes, individual experience in spaces otherwise left out of the picture.
Right. James, before we go today, is there anything that you want to plug? I know that you had a Flatline Constructs reading group, and I believe you even created maybe an audiobook version of at least some of the chapters. Is that correct?
Yes, but those have unfortunately been taken off YouTube. We
Oh,
have
no.
to fix that.
Well, if you do have a Discord link or something that you want to pass to us later, I'll throw it in the show notes if folks want to get in there. And just for anybody who's listened this far, well, I'm assuming that you at least have some interest in Flatline constructs. The reading group is still ongoing, and we have all of the recorded episodes on the Patreon account for Zer0 Books and Repeater Media. And come fall, we will do William Gibson's Neuromancer together in conjunction with this book. And also check us out on Asset Horizon, where we have a few reading groups as well. So, James, I just want to say thanks for coming on, and we really appreciate your voice in the reading group.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, been a great experience.
We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zer0 Books today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zer0 has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.